Hello everyone, welcome, thanks for joining me. This is the second of 4 talks that will follow the historical Silk Road from Europe across Asia to China and beyond. Today we're looking at Central Asia, east of the Mesopotamian area and west of the modern border of China. The Silk Road name was made up by a geographer in the late 19th century, and it's misleading because there was not some single road or highway. Instead, the term identifies a web of shifting paths and unmarked trails that historically wove from town to town across Central and Western Asia. And so that's why I'm using the plural for these talks, Silk Roads. So someone in a village between Nishapur and Mashhad wouldn't think of it as the Silk Road, or the road to Palmyra or Samarkand even, probably. Rather, they just think of it as the road to whatever the next town was. But altogether, these little local roads eventually wound their way across the continent. The most famous Western traveler of the Silk Road was probably the Venetian Marco Polo, who published a famous account of his rather sometimes fantastic journey. Polo set out with his uncle on a trading expedition in 1271 from Venice, and they traveled from Venice to what is modern Beijing. He then stayed in China for some time working for the Yuan dynasty under the Mongolian Kublai Khan. Finally, he returned to Venice via Southeast Asia along the sea route and arrived back in Venice a full 24 years after his original departure. Now, Marco Polo was a very rare exception. In Central Asia, most commerce and travel on the Silk Road was regional, with merchants doing a route between just a few neighboring towns. Merchants would travel together to form caravans for safety, but these big caravans with hundreds of people and animal that we imagine are actually quite rare, and there was no paved or marked route. So goods went from town to town, shuffling along as they were bought and resold, rather than traveling all the way from China to the Mediterranean in a single trip. Now, there were large caravans that covered thousands of miles, but these were official diplomatic envoys carrying tribute between kingdoms. The majority of objects transported on the Silk Roads were not luxury, exotic items, but more utilitarian, locally produced things like textiles or food or business documents and letters. Often, unfamiliar objects were carried not specifically by traders, but rather by people who were resettling in a new location, so moving from one village to another. But even these little things, or the odd object here and there, could have a big impact. So here I'm showing you 2 different examples of pottery, of ceramic pottery. On the left, we have a ewer that was produced in Tang Dynasty, China. On the right is a bowl that was produced in Iran. You'll notice that the one on the right has a very similar glaze or color and design pattern to the one on the left, and that's because at some point a Chinese ewer, or rather Chinese ceramic vessel with this same pattern and glaze decoration as this ewer arrived in Iran, and the locals were so taken with it that it inspired potters in Iran to produce objects with that same pattern or with that same mode of decoration. So we see an example of pottery being emulated quite far away, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from its original place of production. Now, along with the spread of visual patterns, though, was the spread of ideas. And Central Asia really provides us with a perfect demonstration of how religion spread along trade routes. So we're going to focus today on this region here, what today includes Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. We will look first at the Sasanian Empire, originating in Iran, and then at the Sogdian peoples, centered in Samarkand. Our time frame today is going to be basically the 3rd through 9th centuries CE, and these 2 groups, the Sogdians and Sasanians, had a great deal in common. They both spoke an Iranian language. Religiously, they were both predominantly Zoroastrian, and of course they were both situated on major trade routes. But as we'll see, the Sasanians and Sogdians were also very different. Last month, we talked about the ancient city of Palmyra, which really flourished thanks to its position between the Mediterranean with its ports and then the river corridor of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Palmyrans were merchants and entrepreneurs, and they also managed the transportation of goods across the desert to the rivers. So they had this kind of niche, both geographically and commercially. Now, on the other side of the rivers was the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanians were constantly at war with first the Romans and then the Byzantines, off and on for centuries, really. The Sasanian homeland was in Fars, but they made their capital at Ctesiphon on the Euphrates River. This whole kingdom had been a collection of fractured kingdoms prior to the Sasanians, but the Sasanians brought centralized governance to the region and stabilizing it. They also actively reasserted Persian culture after a long period of foreign influence. But unfortunately for us, very few Sasanian texts survive, which really limits our knowledge of them. The remaining material culture is mostly either very small objects like coins and seals like you see here, or monumental works of architecture and sculpture, which we'll be looking at today as we turn to a site north of the city of Shiraz in the Sasanian homeland. Nashke Rostam is where the four great kings of the Achaemenid Empire have their tombs, carved into the living rock of this cliffside. Here we see on the right the tomb of Darius the Great, in the middle Artaxerxes I, and on the left Darius II. Now, the tomb of Darius the Great, Darius is the one who ruled the empire during its height, stabilizing it internally, expanding its borders, instituting administrative reorganization, and is generally considered to have been a remarkable ruler and probably saw one of, if not the height of the Achaemenid Empire. Now, you might also remember that it was Darius and his son Xerxes who attempted to conquer Greece during the Greco-Persian Wars of 490 and 480 BCE. Also carved into the cliff face with these tombs are several massive scenes commemorating Sasanian rulers, added later, and deliberately connecting the Sasanians to the Persian Achaemenid Empire through this important site, essentially borrowing the authority of the site in order to lend authority and validity to their own reign. Here in this relief, we see the first Sasanian ruler, Ardashir I, on the left. He formed the empire and gained power in part by overthrowing the king of neighboring Parthia. So here, Ardashir is being given the command to rule by the god Ahura Mazda, who we see on the right. This relief is absolutely gigantic. As you can see, it's over double life-sized. And it's a bit hard to make out all the details, however, just because of the lighting, so I'll show you a few different views as we talk about it. So on the left, we have Ardashir, who is seated on his horse and accepting the ring that represents power and authority. With his right hand, with his left hand, he's making a gesture with the index finger raised that was a sign of respect, basically. Interestingly, each Sasanian king has his own unique crown, which lets us identify them pretty clearly. It's actually really convenient. And Ardashir's crown is this rather unusual sort of globe that looks, has drapery on it, so I assume it must be textile somewhat. But it allows us to identify him. And it's really interesting and significant that Ardashir and Ahura Mazda are represented as the same size. This is a little bit unusual because usually in Near Eastern art and many other cultures, they use what we call hierarchy of scale, so that the most important figure, in this case Ahura Mazda, since he's a god, would be larger than the other figures. So instead here, they are the same size and their horses are in the same position, and it creates this mirror image so that the scene as a whole is very symmetrical right down the center. Now each horse is trampling another figure, which shows that the defeat and subjugation of these figures. The one on the left, being trampled by Ardashir, is the previous ruler, whom Ardashir had rebelled against and deposed. It's showing his the fact that he's been conquered by Ardashir. And then on the right, Ahura Mazda is crushing the evil god Ahriman. So now we have to ask, of course, who are Ahura Mazda and Ahriman? Well, they are the primary figures in the Zoroastrian or Mazdian religion. Zoroastrianism is the world's oldest continuously practiced religion, so it's actually rather strange that we don't know more about its founder, Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. We think that he was probably from eastern Iran and maybe lived around the year 1000 BCE. We do know that he claimed to have had a series of divine revelations from luminous beings. And essentially, the idea is that there's a constant cosmic war between good and evil. Ahura Mazda is a good, omniscient, eternal, non-created god, and Ahriman is evil. Now, Ahura Mazda is omniscient, so he knows everything, but he's not omnipotent, so he's not all-powerful. However, eventually evil will be defeated. The good will be resurrected in paradise, and those who are bad will be purged of their evilness so that they can actually also go eventually to paradise. But Zoroastrianism really emphasizes truth as a supreme virtue. There's an emphasis on free will and righteousness. And overall, the faith has certainly changed over the years, but the triumph of good and order over evil and chaos remains a central idea. Fire also has always had a central place in Zoroastrianism, and from around the Sasanian period onto today, they maintain sacred eternal flames in fire temples. And on the right side of this relief, you can see on the altar is a flame. On the left is the ruler Xerxes, and then in the center is Ahura Mazda holding a ring of power and set up in the sky in this kind of bird-like seal. So returning to the relief on Ardashir, we can see this as a really well-conceived bit of propaganda. How can Ardashir make himself seem legitimate by the Parthian half of his subjects after he just usurped the throne? Well, by claiming that Ahura Mazda had withdrawn his approval from the previous king and given authority to Ardashir. By presenting himself in this way, by mirroring Ahura Mazda, Ardashir becomes the worldly representative of the divine order. So Ahura Mazda rules eternally over everything, and Ardashir rules the empire in the temporal world. Ahura Mazda conquers evil and chaos, and Ardashir tramples a false ruler. After Ardashir, the other Sasanian rulers followed his lead by having themselves commemorated on similar reliefs, which then, of course, legitimizes their rule by placing themselves as successors to Ardashir. The Sasanian kingdom extended its control quite far to the east, into India, in fact, into the edge of China. But far away from the empire's center, the power was largely just in the form of a patron-client state relationship. What that means is that the actual administration of a city and area was done by some local ruler who then paid tribute to the Sasanian king. He would acknowledge his authority and agreed to provide troops when the king requested. And this was the case with Sogdiana, which we'll turn to now. Now, to really have an understanding of the Silk Road and trade in Central Asia, we need to look at the topography, which, as you can see here, is extremely harsh and difficult terrain. There are bands of mountains, most of them quite high and rugged. The Tibetan Plateau kind of dominates the whole continent. The places where there are not mountains are large deserts, and then there's the occasional pocket of open steppe. So what this means is that there are just limited options for viable routes. And it also means that which route you take will depend very much on the season and the weather conditions, because it can be very dangerous very quickly on the mountain trails. And so because there's this kind of topographic bottleneck, it means that if you can control a handful of routes, you can essentially monopolize the entire transcontinental trade. And that's precisely what the Sogdians did. Now, we're really just learning about the Sogdians. As with the Sasanians, there are just a few texts that remain. We know that Sogdian was an Iranian language, and they used a variety of the Aramaic alphabet, and like the Sasanians, they were predominantly Zoroastrian, although, as we'll see, it was a much more heterogeneous take on the faith than was practiced in the West. They were also tributaries. They paid tribute to the Sasanian rulers. The Sogdians themselves were highly dispersed throughout Central Asia, and although they maintained their unique identity within the other communities, it's sometimes difficult to correctly determine whether an object is Sogdian or originating in one of the many, many other cultures active in the area. So it seems that our understanding of the Sogdians has also been limited by the fact that their homeland today around modern Samarkand has been limited by the fact that it's located in the former Soviet Union. So while there were excavations and research happening, it just wasn't available to other scholars internationally like one would hope. But we do know that because of their location and their ability to essentially network, the Sogdians achieved something of a monopoly on Central Asian trade. While there continued to be Sogdians abroad, especially in China, their homeland of Sogdiana was largely abandoned after being conquered by Arab Islamic forces in the late 18th century. It was just a few decades before this invasion that the Sogdian city of Panjikend was at its height. Not much remains of the city today, as you can see, although you can get a rough sense of its layout in this aerial view of the excavation. So what does remain, however, it gives us a sense of the wealth and cosmopolitanism and unique character of Sogdian Silk Road culture. So here, for example, is what's left of a cycle of paintings from a home in Panjikend that depicts the adventures of the legendary Iranian hero Rostam. In this detail, we have Rostam followed by his men. They're moving towards the right against this really stunning blue background. And notice we have fairly realistic proportions here. Everything is placed on a single ground line. The figures are stylized, but not too heavily. And so this is kind of the pictorial treatment that's not primarily decorative, but rather communicative. So what that means is that the artist is composing the scene and representing everything in a way that highlights the story and makes the narrative clear to viewers. This isn't simply a decorative painting, even though it's in a home. But that doesn't mean that it isn't highly artistic. So here Rostam is fighting a dragon that is shown with the body of a snake and the torso of a human. It's trapped to the horse's legs and is pulling Rostam's head into its gaping mouth. Now, luckily, we know that our hero defeats the dragon and emerges unscathed. What is remarkable in this scene is how the artist has balanced the clarity and drama of the narrative with these really beautiful decorative elements. So the coils of the dragon creates these sweeping curves that visually convey motion and tension, and then creates a visual stop or barrier for the lateral motion of the horse. So as the dragon rears up on the left in this kind of wave, the horse comes in from the right in a horizontal motion, and so we have this sense of a collusion of the two enemies crashing into each other in this combat and struggle. Notice also the way that Rostam is depicted. He has exaggeratedly broad shoulders, a tiny little wasp-like waist, very delicate feet. This is pretty characteristic of how individuals are represented in Sogdian art. Here is my attempt at a sort of recreation of the scene. Unfortunately, the central portion of the head of the dragon and of Rostam is very worn away and it's very difficult to reconstruct, but you can get a little bit of a sense of the complexity, the level of detail that was in this mural originally. This intense blue background seems to have been a popular choice in Sogdian homes, because we also find it in another mural cycle from Panjikend. Here we see a Sogdian man who's wearing a kaftan, seated cross-legged and holding a type of horn-shaped drinking vessel that's called a raiton. The raiton was originally developed in Mesopotamia. And here we can see an example of a really spectacular, beautiful raiton that was produced by the Sasanians. So not the Sogdians, but the Sasanians. This one taking the form of a gazelle. And although the one in the mural, it has like a ram's head, it's basically the same idea. Interestingly, although the Sogdians were known as traders and merchants and entrepreneurs, the images that they chose for their own homes have nothing to do with this. They're either epic scenes like the Rostam story, these sort of grand narratives, or they're banqueting scenes like we have here. And once again, we have an example of the type of vessel that this man is holding at the banquet. But this one was made by Sogdians in Samarkand. And you can see that although the Sogdians may have been far from the heart of the Sasanian Empire, that did not mean that their craftsmen were any less skilled. Clearly, they were capable of producing metalwork of really exquisite quality. Discoveries at Afrasiab, a name for an ancient Samarkand, give us some sense of the remarkable cosmopolitanism and diversity of religious practices of the Sogdians. So here we have in the center a beautiful Zoroastrian ossuary, which features two priests who are attending to a central fire altar. Below, a fragment of a Christian ossuary with crosses. A small figure of a female Hellenic or Greek deity is on the left, and then on the right, another little clay figure of the goddess Anahita. Now, Anahita is, interestingly, an Indo-Iranian deity who was really popular all through the Near East and Central and South Asia, so she had a very widespread cult. But she's also seen in another investiture relief at Nashki Rostam, where she is handing over power to the king Narse. So she's here on the left, or excuse me, on the far right of the relief, facing the king, and handing over a ring of power, just like we saw Ahura Mazda doing to the first Sasanian king, Ardashir. We've seen, thanks to the wall paintings, how the Sogdians saw themselves. But how were they seen by the Han Chinese? Well, interestingly, one of the primary types of objects produced during the Tang Dynasty were ceramic figurines to be included in tombs. And the idea seems to be that these figures would provide services for the deceased in the afterlife. The most famous example of this are the terracotta warriors. But here we have two such figures, much smaller, both of Sogdian men. And you'll notice that they are shown wearing a kaftan, not a Chinese fashion at all. They're sporting beards, and they also have very prominent hooked noses. They're often shown either riding camels or handling animals. So the guy on the left was probably a groom holding a horse. He would have had a rope in his hand. The man riding the camel seems to be accompanied by a child behind him, and then seems like a small dog perhaps on his left thigh. And in his left hand, he would originally have had some sort of string or leather strap that is meant to be guiding the camel's head to the left. In addition to merchants, though, the Sogdians were known to the Chinese as entertainers. Sogdian dances were extremely popular, apparently, and the music and dance of Sogdiana was regarded as very exciting and exotic, and so they'd have traveling performers and musician dance troupes come through along these same roads that were used for the transport of goods. Here in the center, we have a Sogdian performing a whirling dance that they were known for. The clothes are billowing and waving around him to convey all of the energy and kinetic movement of this dance. On the right, there's a collection of traveling musicians, all perched rather comically somehow on top of a single camel. They have their lute, their pipes, and so forth. Over time, however, the Sogdian became really a stereotype, a kind of generic barbarian entertainer, and was often associated with drinking and with grape wine, which they imported from the West. So the dancer here on the right is essentially a caricature. The drunken, partying barbarian became so culturally ingrained in Chinese culture that it even eventually made its way to Japan. Here is a wooden mask from the 8th century found at Nara in Japan. It was used for a stock character in the plays, and the character is just the drunken barbarian king. You'll notice the hat, the beard, and the large nose have all been maintained, but they're exaggerated here into this grotesque, leering face. He's clearly not a hero in these plays. This is certainly a long way from how the Sogdians portrayed themselves in Panjikund. There, we certainly see an interest in the joys of music, dancing, and feasting, but it's always with an exquisitely refined elegance, both in the presentation of the figures and overall in the linearity and style of the people and the settings in which they are participating. The Sasanian Empire met its end in the year 651. After decades of wars with the Byzantine Empire, the Sasanians were not able to fight off the invading Arab armies that were establishing an Islamic state. So the Arab Islamic forces conquered the Sasanians and their territory, and eventually reached Sogdiana in the mid-8th century. They struggled for dominance against the various tribes and particular factions there. We know from documents found at a Sogdian fortress that there was military resistance to the invaders, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. So by the time Samarkand was completely conquered, and partially burned, the city's many Sogdian residents and nobles had already fled east into Chinese territory along the same paths that they had built a trading empire on. So there was a large Sogdian diaspora in China for quite a while. Unfortunately, a Sogdian general in the Tang dynasty named An Lushan attempted to rebel and establish independent rule in the empire's western territories in the year 755. And this attempt actually lasted for 8 years and was finally quashed, and Sogdians were faced with increasing suspicion and animosity in the ensuing decades, being persecuted to varying degrees and gradually either forcibly or willingly assimilating over the generations, losing their distinctive Sogdian identity.